We also continue to find other indications of the regime's intentions. I mentioned yesterday that we find equipment located at places that we think they should not be located, and we wonder why they would be. The next image I'll show you is a MiG-23 fighter jet that's been towed into a cemetery near Balad Airfield, north of Baghdad. Inside of the yellow dotted line to the left, you see the ends of the runway and places where aircraft would normally be stored inside of bunkers. About 4,000 feet to the right, as is indicated on this image, in a small box, you see cemetery. In the blow-up, you see the MiG-23 in the corner of the cemetery. The arrow points to the tail end of the aircraft, and the nose is to the right. Finally, I'd like to give an update on the operations in the Rumaila oil field. Of course, the assessment team did go in yesterday and took a close look. One of the things it found was the image you're about to see. This is one of the wellheads in the southern Rumaila oil field. It was rigged for demolition, it was detonated, and it did not ignite. As we arrived, we noticed plenty of evidence of what the intentions were. First, you can see the charred wellhead right in the center. Blasting wire is still inside of the position, and the good news is it did not catch on fire. So this is one that we don't have to put out. We're continuing to work on the 7 that remain.
Come across a truck with 3 Iraqis in it. They were driving a truckload of ammunition. Ammunition and weapons, and the Army quickly took them into custody, bound their hands. They're waiting for the military police come and remove them. There's no one this far forward in the unit who speaks Arabic, so the intelligence coup, such as it is going to have to wait a while. I spoke with the prisoners a few minutes ago in broken Arabic, and they did not sound like they're going to be a mother lode of information. Jim?
We do not, as a country, to need help, any humanitarian help. We have resources that would suffice our people the way it was sufficient 6 years earlier. We are asking you to condemn these decisions and to condemn the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Britain, who were stopping and preventing delivery of these supplies, food and medicine to the Iraqi people.
Listening to Alessio and our colleagues down in the south, it all seems rather unreal, the situation here. It's very quiet. There's very little happening. Early this morning, we heard 2 large explosions in the direction of Mosul. Last night there was fairly intense bombing of that city, but here it couldn't be more quiet. We were down in the village of Kalak, which is right behind me, going among the houses. We were looking up at the Iraqi position, seeing the soldiers, the Iraqi soldiers, not more than really a kilometer away from us. Under normal conditions, maybe a 10-minute walk away from us. They were walking along the ridgeline as if nothing was happening whatsoever. They're still digging in, preparing their positions. Now, we do know, for instance, that in Erbil, the city where it's about half an hour's drive from here, that U.S. Special Forces have arrived. They're settling in. They're arriving at an airport that's about an hour's drive outside of Erbil. They're arriving at the Harir airstrip. Now, yesterday we did see for the first time the head of the U.S. mission in the north, Major General Pete Osman of the U.S. Marine Corps. But when he spoke to us, it really sounded more like he was here in addition to trying to activate this fairly dormant northern front, that he was here to keep the different military activities separated. Now, many Kurds are very concerned about the possibility that Turkish forces are going to enter. In fact, this morning I was speaking with one Kurdish commander who was saying that this war in Iraq right now is England and America's war. It's not the war of the Kurds. They're happy to take part of it because of their animosity toward Saddam Hussein, given their bitter history with that regime.
Desert has hampered the advance of the American 3rd Infantry 50 miles south of Baghdad. It has grounded Black Hawk and Apache helicopters, reduced the amount of air support, and made for very tough soldiering.
Can't wait to get back home. Been over here 5 months already, and we're just ready to get it done and go home right now.
Sand gets in your eyes, it's hard to breathe, you know, and we're pushing through it. That's what we get paid to do. That's why we're here.
It was left to the artillery to attack the Republican Guard. These British gunners, attached to the Royal Marines, are specially trained in Arctic warfare, but were battling today through a different kind of weather.
It's a little bit ugly out there today. Weather has had an impact on the battlefield with high winds, with some rain, with some thunderstorms. However, that hasn't stopped us.
Despite the weather, there were 1,400 combat missions today, mainly by American aircraft like these from the carrier Constellation. The US Navy specializes in the spectacular, but war is about killing people and blowing things up.
If the American soldiers, the invaders, will enter the territory of Iraq, they will be received with bullets, not flowers, not music, with bullets.
Further south, near Basra, Abu Dhabi television showed images of destroyed Iraqi vehicles after a major battle with the British. The British and Americans have declared Basra a military objective, but have not entered it. Defiant Iraqis in Basra too, and a real danger for the British in being drawn into guerrilla warfare. There were more troop deployments tonight from the Ark Royal as the British take over responsibility for all operations in southern Iraq. Martin Bell, 5 News.
Because we're in the middle of just a vicious sandstorm, which is why I'm wearing these ski goggles, because it's about the only thing that can protect your eyes. Typical day, I mean, we've been rolling with these tanks and Bradleys for most of the time since the ground war started Thursday night, local time, our time. You know, we sleep sort of crunched up inside this M88, this tank recovery vehicle, and you grab an MRE, a meal ready to eat, which is the same thing that these soldiers eat when you can, and you try to shave every day or two, and you know, I mean, it's not easy conditions, but as I've said, it's, you know, their lot in life is a lot harder than ours, because in addition to everything else, they're trying to fight. You can see these guys behind me. I mean, this sandstorm has just been horrible today, and they've been trying to fix this engine for this Bradley fighting vehicle in the midst of this sandstorm when the sand sticks to the oil in the engine, and they're trying to get it fixed. They're trying to get it back inside the Bradley that you see over there, which is what 8 or 9 guys squeeze inside of. And it sounds like they're having some success because they're cheering right now. But these are not obviously ideal living or working conditions.
Around 18 miles away, those shells will have killed everyone within an area the size of a football stadium. They're firing towards Basra, targeting tanks, bunkers and Iraqi artillery. These guns have certainly not been idle, but there is a sense of frustration among the gunners who operate them that there are some targets which could pose a threat to coalition forces, but they aren't allowed to target them.
There was some tanks refuelling, 5 to 6 of them, but we couldn't engage them because we were right next to a built-up area, a hospital, so we just couldn't engage them, so it was left to other means.
And how does that make the men feel?
Well, a bit disappointed because we're here just now trying to get the war done, get it over with, and we're just being held up by things.
Just stopping us going forward, really. That's all we want to do. We just want to do our job and get out of here.
But it's not just the Iraqi army's tactics that force these gunners to sit and wait. Back behind the front line, the 7th Armoured Brigade must also tackle the stubborn resistance from the armed supporters of Saddam's regime.
But he has some fervent following in there. The Fedayeen and his special police forces, the SSO, are putting up a struggle. And as that struggle becomes more asymmetric, more terrorist-like in its nature, it becomes harder for us, configured here as conventional forces, to fight against it.
So, hard to use this kind of firepower to hit Iraqi tanks sitting next to hospitals. Even harder to fight the armed militia still roaming southern Iraq. Effectively, the British Army now has a conventional war and a guerrilla war to fight simultaneously. Catherine Jones, southern Iraq.
The Operation Commander has declared that the southern port town of Qasr is secure. Yet even as Brigadier Jim Dutton spoke, his own troops were out on the streets searching for pockets of Iraqi resistance.
Let me also tell you, while we look at these pictures, that the news coming in this afternoon is that there has been some kind of popular uprising in the southern city of Basra.
US tanks and armoured cars have been stopped in their tracks, not so much by the Iraqis as by the weather. Baghdad or bust? Well, for now, bust is exactly what some of the American armoured vehicles are. But for the troops, exhausted after their relentless advance, this enforced delay is at least a chance to rest, and they're putting a brave face on it.
There's nothing that'll slow us down. This is kind of, to me, it's not that bad. Just a little saying, never hurt nobody.
Despite the sandstorms, some Allied troops have still been pounding the Iraqis with artillery. And Britain and America insist their war plan is still on schedule. American troops clashing with the Republican Guard south of the capital, Baghdad, while fighting escalates in the second city of Basra. As the fighting's got worse today, so has the weather. Not only sandstorms, but thunderstorms too. And they're not making it any easier for the British troops of 7th Armoured Brigade, the famous Desert Rats, now fully engaged in what is rapidly becoming the battle for Basra. Arabic television has shown pictures of roads close to Basra littered with Iraqi vehicles destroyed in the Allied onslaught. The British now say Basra is one of their military targets because they say they have to get humanitarian aid into the city's 1.5 million people, and they're being stopped from doing so by fighters loyal to Saddam Hussein. British commanders here say those fighters are using human shields to protect them.
A new departure this morning. Our 7th Armoured Brigade, who are the force around there, have reported irregular forces, gunmen coming forward with civilians in front of them. We assume being coerced. We are not returning far because we cannot afford to hit the civilians. Clearly, this further contravenes any of the laws of armed conflict.
But we went to the Al Dora refinery on the outskirts of Baghdad, a huge oil processing facility built by Britain. Around the plant, burning oil-filled trenches belch out black smoke across the city, aimed at trying to confuse British and American warplanes. But the plant is still operating.
From what I've been able to see from this refinery just on the outskirts of Baghdad, Britain and the United States' claim that they are not targeting major economic and civilian infrastructure is holding true.
Iraq has been showing pictures of what it says is an American surveillance drone which has been shot down. People here know that American troops are only 60 miles outside the Iraqi capital, yet the authorities here remain remarkably confident. Ordinary Iraqis realize that the decisive phase will come when Britain and the United States fight street by street for control of Baghdad, something they found it difficult to do in other cities. Raghi Omar, BBC News, Baghdad.
In war, expect the unexpected. Monsoon has come to the desert, torrential rain to a town desperate for water. The port of Qasr is in the hands of 42 Commando Royal Marines. They have the most political of tasks ahead, to get these derelict docks ready to receive humanitarian aid to feed and water much of Iraq.
I'd anticipate we'll be looking at days more than anything else, because we can open specific berths more quickly than opening the whole port. The plan is therefore not to open the whole port and then get the ships in. It's to open up berths, and then when the berths are clear, to get the ships in.
But even the sea is dangerous. There is an Iraqi mining vessel sunk beneath these waves. It has live mines on board. Australian divers are here to remove them one by one.
So what we're doing now is just verifying the amount of mines on board, and then we'll dispose them at a safer time.
So these have to be disposed before shipping can come in here?
Yeah.
Do you hear anything at night? Do you hear any gunfire?
A fair bit of like artillery, maybe mortars. A fair bit of mortars at night, like this morning. Wake is keeping us up all night, so yeah, it's pretty
gunfire. A lot of spread gunfire.
And there is an extraordinary non-human source of help. Specially trained dolphins using their natural sonar detect danger signals and lead the divers to mines. Their agility helps them avoid injury. This remarkable collaboration between man and marine beast will help keep this shipping lane open.
Inside its perimeter, the port is secure. Getting aid in by sea is one thing, but moving it on from here by land, much, much harder. The coalition troops here are under intense political pressure to get this port open as soon as possible and start humanitarian aid flowing. The trouble is there's nowhere for it to flow to. For right outside the perimeter fence lies dangerous territory. Qasr is not the problem, it is where the problem will soon begin. Alan Little, BBC News, Qasr, southern Iraq.
In the last town before the Turkey-Iraq border, the military presence is unmistakable. Jeeps, trucks and soldiers are a common sight here now, but mystery shrouds the area beyond this town. The other side of this checkpoint has been a closed military zone for weeks as tension has risen on the border 10 miles away.
It's common knowledge there's been a big build-up of troops behind me. Turkey has made it clear that it's prepared for the worst, but no one has seen the scale and nature of that build-up because the whole area, from here to the border, has been sealed.
These pictures were shot inside the closed military zone by someone with access to the area. They clearly show an enormous military presence of troops and heavy armor. Turkey says this force would be to deal with a refugee crisis. But the turrets of tanks are clearly visible. This military force has another purpose: to suppress any ambition the Kurds of northern Iraq have of creating a breakaway state of their own.
Is Basra, tantalisingly close, but still beyond the reach of British troops. The burnt-out shells of Iraqi tanks proof they're making progress. But as we drove to the front line, the scale of the battle they've had to fight unfolds. Fields are scattered with the remnants of Republican Guards armour. The soldiers just back from forward positions complain about the underhand Iraqi tactics, which are turning this into an ugly standoff. One of the biggest threats facing these troops are the random attacks being launched from within inside Basra itself. They believe that the soldiers are using ordinary people as human shields and concealing their activities in public buildings. There have even been reports of troops coming out in civilian cars, waving white flags and then opening fire. With coalition forces to the north and south of Basra, the city of over 1 million people is effectively under siege, its residents increasingly desperate. Consignments of food and water are ready to roll into Basra, but it could be 3 more days before it gets through. The British have 10 water tankers and thousands of rations not far from the city. Behind the lines in abandoned Iraqi positions, the British are disabling tanks and weapons, blowing them up with explosives so they don't pose any further danger. I was also shown one of 45 ammunition dumps, stacked from floor to ceiling with tons of shells and missiles. Firepower to defend Basra, intended for use against the British and Americans. It's essential that the British get rid of all this ammunition. If they were simply to leave it here, there's a very good chance that the Iraqi paramilitaries would sneak back to these bunkers and use this against the coalition forces. The arms are being sealed up, only to be dug out once peace is established. Juliet Bremner, ITV News, near Basra.
It's not merely the darkness. We've been in a sandstorm throughout this entire day, which is really bogging down these forces, making life miserable for them. It certainly affects the fighting power of this U.S. military in a couple ways. Number one, this is a tank brigade that I'm with, mostly tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles. And while the tanks and Bradleys can operate in this environment, their close air support, especially the American-made Apache helicopters, have a very difficult time, very dangerous. Their engines clog up. Frankly, they crash in this kind of weather, so they can't get the close air support that they need to make this assault on the Republican Guard, which they're anticipating making in the next couple days. Number two, it's very difficult on the equipment. Behind me, I don't even think you can necessarily see this anymore, but about 10 to 15 feet behind me, there are half a dozen American mechanics working on a Bradley engine, which is a vehicle that's just over there, and they're trying to get this engine repaired. But you can imagine that in this sandstorm, with the sand just whipping through and sticking and clogging up the engine, it makes the repair work that much more difficult.
That last week were ruled by Saddam Hussein's secret police and troops. Royal Marines walked today, and they came as liberators. Amid the cheers of the children, guarded smiles from the men of Qasr, many of whom told me they could not talk openly today. Saddam's men are still around. It's still too dangerous. The Marines brought out a trailer full of rations and water. It wasn't full for long. People here have had little food and no water for 4 days. The Allied bombing means there's no electricity, no working sewage system. There's a lot to put right. This is a port city, and normally they're wealthy in what was once one of the richest countries in the Arab world. After a quarter of a century of Saddam Hussein's rule, plus it has to be said 12 years of UN sanctions, it's been reduced to this, and it's not a pretty sight. As word spreads, more and more men emerge from their homes, a Marine reassuring them in Arabic.
إن بكرة بعد بكرة هنشوف الأعمال في المواد هنا ماشي. But hopefully tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, everything will be better.
But food, water, medicine?
Yeah, this is one thing we're all getting them. Before we're getting food and water, they're asking for cigarettes, so, you know.
The Marines now control a town that rebelled against Saddam 12 years ago. A revolt that was brutally put down, the leaders executed on these streets. And they're still afraid of Saddam's regime here. It's as clear as the stench in the air. With a loudspeaker, the Marines spread the word. We're here to bring stability and normality as soon as possible. But little here has ever been normal. Wealth goes through Qasr's port to Saddam's regime, but none stays. Among these people are doctors and lawyers, unable to practice, branded disloyal, traitors. On a night patrol, the Marines surround the headquarters of Saddam's party and fire mortars. But his men aren't there. They are still around, though. Danger lurks in Qasr. The Marines are warned of ambushes, tripwires and traps. Tomorrow they'll bring a shipload of food, water and medicine and try again to win hearts and minds here. But in the ruins of a broken town, it won't be quick and it won't be easy. Bill Neely, ITV News with the Royal Marines in Qasr.
This is very, very difficult to ordinary people.
Certainly a measure of calm does appear to be returning. There are still regular searches, but the atmosphere seems less hostile. And sufficient trust has been built for coalition soldiers to allow an ambulance with injured people to pass, bound for Basra.
Bombardment to date of Iraqi positions on the northern front. These explosions located east of the city of Mosul. There was also sporadic firing across the increasingly nervous Iraqi Kurdish front lines. And people living on the Kurdish side began leaving their homes. Rumours had already been spreading about the imminent outbreak of fighting in the area, and the local political faction governing the region was giving out warnings.
They sent a message to us saying we should leave because there's going to be shooting. We have 7 children and they have so few clothes and shoes. Where are we going to go?
These rare pictures from inside the city of Mosul show people chanting their support for Saddam Hussein after seeing his national address on TV. The city has a mixed population of Arabs and Kurds, and it's an important military center at one end of Iraq's second biggest oil field. In order to capture the city, American special forces, whose presence in the Kurdish-held area is becoming more and more obvious, will take a leading role. Opening up the northern front would tie down Iraqi army units while the advance on Baghdad continues from the south. That's a prospect which fills the people in Kurdish villages right under the Iraqi forward positions, such as Kalak, with hope tinged with fear. While a kind of everyday life continues, the sound of gunfire is routine.
Prepare Qasr for the relief efforts. The units will build a centre for coordinating relief supplies and the distribution of clean water. US President George W. Bush is calling on Congress to act quickly and responsibly as he outlined a $74.7 billion emergency spending request. He said the spending is directly related to winning the war. And Iraqi television has shown pictures of a drone aircraft being driven through the streets of Basra. The drone appeared to be a British Phoenix unmanned aerial vehicle designed to provide battlefield surveillance and targeting.
Last hour or so have slowed the progress into this region.
But over the next several days, as the storm lifts, we will undoubtedly see the coalition begin to attack with direct fire weapons the guard units south of Baghdad. That still remains the most significant military challenge which the coalition faces. We'll obviously watch the Basra developments unfold very closely in these coming hours.
Some of them have been flexi-cuffed because U.S. military commanders believe they may be members of a paramilitary group to whom they attribute the stiff resistance against U.S. forces in Nasiriyah.
U.S. military commanders here say among Iraqi forces on the other side of the front line are so-called Saddam's Fedayeen paramilitary group. They are a concern to U.S. forces here because one of the tactics of the Fedayeen is to mingle among civilians. And the U.S. Marines here say they want to avoid as much as possible killing civilians.
The commanders have identified that certain civilian vehicles with certain markings and certain colors have been deemed as resupply vehicles. And that's the way these guys work, you know. They'll stage or cache weapons and ammunition out here. So we've been authorized to engage certain civilian vehicles.
Alessio Vinci, CNN, with the U.S. Marines in Nasiriyah, Iraq.
Port of Qasr are also the first out. The shadowy, civilian-clothed Iraqi fighters who played a game of shoot-and-go-hide with them seem to have lost. So now they're sent deeper into Iraq, to another objective, to another reported hotspot. On the road, they witness a deteriorating country. Villagers wave at them as they pass by. Bombed out Iraqi military hardware off the road. More detained Iraqis, perhaps civilian, perhaps not. The omnipresent, smiling face of Saddam Hussein greeting them upon their arrival. iPad, do you have visual on that, over? Their work begins right away.
We're taking gunfire from them.
Out in the distance, ununiformed Iraqi soldiers again fighting what the Marines consider an unfair fight. Potshots from men in civilian clothing dispersed among the civilian population. The responsive choice is to use missiles, mortars, and bullets, virtually guaranteeing the obliteration of the opponent. Shortly after opening their fire, an ambulance rolls up.
Watch out for this to be a trap.
It's too hard for them to see through their binoculars who's getting in. But the image is a reminder that their weapons have no conscience. Presumed civilians, men, women, and children, wave a white flag to surrender. These are not the gunmen they're looking for. The cat and mouse game is not one Marines like to play.
Where the hell are we going to bring these EPWs?
As hours drag on, frustration overtakes inhibition. So Marines wait for the order to fire once again, knowing no matter how well they kill, in this situation, it's hard for any of them to be heroes. Jason Bellini, CNN.
Gale force winds carry in a sandstorm, which mixed with dense smoke from the oil fires has reduced visibility to just a few yards. The focus of the coalition aerial bombardment has switched from the center of the city to the suburbs in the south and west, where it's believed units of the Republican Guard are now basing themselves, some in urban areas.
Sweepers try to ready Qasr port for tens of thousands of tons of food aid waiting on ships far out in the Gulf. Australian frogmen are getting wet anyway beneath this fast-flowing cocktail of sewage, mud, and crude oil with visibility the length of your arm.
All you can see in the distance is a dark object, so you have to swim up on it and then basically use your hands to work out what it is.
No booby traps so far, but they found 4 sea mines on a sunken mine-laying boat just there. They say Qasr's now secure, but troops say the sound of gunfire has been spoiling their sleep. British Marines drove journalists into Qasr to show that their campaign's not all bombs and bullets.
It's a huge port. It can take a huge volume of ships, and what we hope to do is to get those ships in good order so that we can get this humanitarian supplies ashore, onto trucks, and out to the people who so desperately need it.
But this is only a snapshot. People have been putting to sea from here for as long as there have been ships. Iraq's other big port, Basra, looks straight across its waterway to its longtime adversary, Iran. And the path to the sea from here runs under the lee of Kuwaiti territory. Result, decades of friction and clashes. This port was wrecked in 2 wars, the Iran-Iraq War and Desert Storm. But the British say it's still in reasonable shape. Until the threat of war shut it down, Qasr brought in 2/3 of the food that fed 2/3 of the Iraqis under the UN Oil for Food program. Now, one berth is ready, and the Marines won't wait for the rest to be cleared before turning on a promised torrent of supplies. Richard Blystone, CNN, Qasr, southern Iraq.